Hello, my name is Caleb Williams. I'm a graduate student at Cornell University working with the research group of Miguel Gomez. We have been commissioned by the New York State Berry Growers Association to look into the production costs of berries, and in that research we were able to develop a couple of tools to help farmers analyze their different production costs for blueberries, for strawberries, and for raspberries. The purpose of this video today is to go through how to use these tools. We will review one of these berries. We will review blueberries today, and the tools are similar for each of the different berries, so after viewing this video you should know how to use each one of those three different tools. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Daniel Welch very much for the cost studies that he put together several years ago. Daniel Welch is an extension agent at Cornell University. We'd also like to thank the Berry Growers Association for funding this research, and we especially thank the berry growers that have spoken with us, have allowed us to interview them to understand the different production practices in the state over the last handful of months. In this video today, we will first review the purposes and limitations of these tools, and then I will jump right in and show you how to use the tool. So, the purposes. There are two main reasons that we created these tools. The first is to help berry growers disentangle their costs that are specifically related to their berry production from the costs that are related to their other crops, which is something we found to be somewhat rare amongst growers because they grew so many different types of crops. The second was to help growers compare those costs to what a representative farm might expect in New York State, and this with the intent of helping people identify their areas of strength and their areas of weakness. Limitations. The first and biggest limitation, of course, is that there are, so to speak, many ways to skin a cat, or many ways to grow berries. The results here are generalized to a representative farm in the state, and as many of you know, there are many different ways to produce berries. So some of these results you might find off or striking, while other results you think make sense. The second limitation is that the output quality is only as good as the input quality. So without any further ado, we'll jump right in on how to use this tool. Today we're going to be looking at the blueberry production cost analysis tool, but if you're looking at the raspberry tool or the strawberry tool, you'll notice that the layout is exactly the same. So this first page, this introduction tab, goes through a lot of the same things that we just went through, but then it also lays out the different tabs that are in this workbook. So you'll see here the blue tab is where you're going to answer questions about your production practices. The green tabs will give you an analysis or a report card where you can compare your costs to the cost for a representative farm for your production year, for your production year, for your pre-production year, and for your wages and use rates. The orange tab lays out the assumed production practices for this representative farm that you will be comparing your farm to. And the gray tab here is just for calculations. You're not going to need to do anything with this tab. So on to the questionnaire tab, this blue tab. One note is that you can arrive to any one of these tabs by clicking on this link that is right here, or you can just click on the tabs down here at the bottom. So let's click on the blue tab and it takes us right to this blue tab. Now these are the instructions, go ahead and read through them. But basically what it's telling you is that you have three sections in this questionnaire. This first section is your pre-production year operations, or in other words, this is going to ask you questions about your operations in years that you are not harvesting these berries. This second section that you see here is your production year operations, or any years that you are harvesting berries from that acreage. You will answer questions about that acreage here in this section. And then a much smaller section about your wages and use rates. Your wages, how much are you paying employees, and how much is it costing you to run equipment. So that's the layout of the page. You'll notice over here that you have two columns. There's a My Answer column and a Representative Farm column. This is the only column in the entire workbook that you will be entering information into. You'll notice that you have a My Answer section for the pre-production year, for the production year, and for your wages and use rates. And that's where you will put information in. You'll also notice this other column over here called the representative farm column. This column, you'll notice right now, has a bunch of zeros, mainly zeros. It will not populate with any useful information until you answer this first question. So let's go ahead and read this first question. In 2017, how many acres of blueberries were planted on your farm? It says the rest of your answers in this block will be in terms of how long it took you to complete activities on all of the acres you planted in 2017, not how long it took to complete activities on 1 acre. So the first part of that says how many acres of blueberries were planted on your farm. So if in 2017 you planted 2 acres of blueberries, meaning that you actually put the plants in the ground that year, you would enter 2 here. And then you notice that this representative farm column has a lot more useful information, but not until you answer that question. And then you can continue on. How many labor hours were spent collecting soil samples from plots planted to blueberries? Now, I'm not answering the question of how many hours did it take me per acre. I'm answering the question of how many hours did it take me for all of these 2 acres that I have right here. I can look over here, maybe I'm having a hard time, I don't remember exactly how long that was. I can look over here in my representative farm column and see that on the representative farm, it takes about 2 acres, or 2 hours, to take the soil samples from these 2 acres. Let's say that I think that I took a little bit longer than that, so I'm going to say 2.5. And then I go on to the next question. Ground preparation. How many tractor hours were spent preparing ground for planting by plowing, disking, harrowing, tilling, etc.? So in other words, for these 2 acres, how long did it take me to plow, disc, harrow, anything that I did to physically prepare that ground for planting? Now let's say that I know that that took me exactly 5 hours for all of those operations. And notice that's tractor hours, not labor hours. So I put 5 in there. And then I come over here and it says how many labor hours are spent on these same ground preparation activities. I know that to hook and unhook all the implements is going to take me a little bit longer. Let's say maybe it takes me 15 minutes longer per hour. So we'll say that's 6.25, 6.25 hours. And then I move on to the next question. How many times was this ground fertilized? Let's see, I've fertilized it once at the beginning of the year and once at the end of the year. So 2 times. And then I go on and you'll notice that all of these questions fall into one of 3 types essentially. You have how many times did something happen, or in other words, a frequency, how many tractor hours were spent on that activity, and how many labor hours were spent on that activity. And the rest of these questions follow essentially that same format. So I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead right now and fill a lot of these in automatically. As I go through this, there's a couple of things that I want to point out. The first is what to do if you need to enter a value of 0, or if this doesn't apply to you. So for example, with planting, it asks how many tractor hours were spent planting. If you planted everything by hand, didn't use any tractors for it at all, or any machinery for it at all, enter a 0. Don't leave anything blank, because the calculations require numbers to work with. The next thing I wanted to review was this irrigation application section. It can be a little bit tricky. The first question is how many times were these non-bearing blueberries irrigated throughout each year? Now, that's fairly straightforward. Let's say we did it once a week for a handful of months, so 19 times. The next question. How many hours was the pump run during the average irrigation application? Let's say we ran it 8 hours a day, once a week, so 8 hours. Next question is, how many labor hours were spent on each irrigation application? Let's say I turn the pump on, I have a guy there to turn the pump on, and then go check the line to make sure there's no leaks. He spent about an hour each time that he did that. The last question may require a little bit of explanation. It says, on average, how many additional acres of crops, berries or non-berries, were being irrigated by the same pump at the same time as the blueberries you planted in 2017? Now that's asking if your irrigation system was irrigating other things at the same time. That's because you want to know how to allocate those costs, how to allocate the cost of running your pump and how to allocate the labor costs. Now let's say that in addition to these 2 acres that I answered up here, I was also irrigating 4 other acres of crops at that same time, berries or non-berries. So I'm going to put in 4 here. That means that in total, my irrigation system, when I was running it, on average was irrigating these 2 acres and these 4 acres, so 6 acres in total. Okay, now let's say that you were able to fill out all of the pre-production year operations questions. Then you move on to the next section. The next section is talking about production year operations. Now it's very important to remember that these are asking about 2 different things. Right here you have a very similar question at first. It says how many acres of blueberries were in production on your farm in 2017? Or in other words, how many acres of blueberries did you harvest in 2017? Notice that that is different than how many acres of berries did you plant that year. You also need to keep in mind, and this is very important, that all of these questions up here are asking about these 2 acres that you actually planted that year. And all of these questions down here are asking about these acres that were in production that year, that you harvested that year. If you confuse those 2, your results will also be confusing. So let's continue on. How many acres of blueberries were in production on your farm in 2017? Let's say that I had 5 acres of blueberries in production that year, meaning that my total acreage of blueberries is these 5 acres plus these 2 acres. On my farm in 2017, between my recently planted and my already producing berries, I had 7 acres of blueberries. And then I'm going to continue on and fill out the rest of these questions. Now I've filled out all of the production year operation questions, as well as all of the pre-production year operation questions. And I need to move on to the wages and use rates. And these are very simple. The first one is essentially how much do you pay your average laborer? Let's assume that I'm a little bit lower than the representative farm of $16.50. Let's say I pay, including all of the insurance and workman's comp and everything, I'm paying about $14.55 an hour. And then it asks about specialized labor. Now, specialized labor generally will mean what is your wage that you would pay yourself? Because on a lot of the farms that we visited, you're the one that's going out and doing the things that require the specialized labor, like laying out fields or scouting for pests. So what wage rate would you assign to yourself? Let's say that you value yourself a little bit more than this $25 an hour. Let's say that you think your time is worth about $30 an hour. It's a very difficult question, I'm sure, but do your best to estimate it. And then it just asks about equipment use, and it says, what do you estimate your hourly use cost to be for a tractor with standard implements? Now, this includes fuel, fluids, and maintenance, but it's not talking about tractor depreciation cost. So let's say that instead of the $17.50, I think that I can run it a little bit cheaper than that. I've got some really good maintenance guys, so it's costing me $15 an hour. And then it asks about your specialized equipment use, and that's with things with special implements, or your fuel pump or your water pump that you're using to pump your irrigation with. Let's say that I think that including the fuel, the fluids, and the maintenance, that costs me about $25 an hour. Now I've filled out all of the My Answer column. Now it is very important that in this column you do your best to fill out all of the answers, even if it's with a 0. If you don't, some of these report card functions will not work. Your report cards are divided up into 3 different sections at the bottom here, in 3 different tabs. The first report card refers to your pre-production year costs. The second report card to your production year costs, and the third report card to your wages and use rate costs. We broke it up into 3 different tabs just to make it a little easier on the eyes. Let's go to the first one. In each of these report cards, you'll see that there are 2 sections. There's a graphical section and there is a numeric section. They provide the exact same information, but one's more visual than the other. So let's go through this first section here. I see that my costs are indicated by the blue bars and the representative farm costs are indicated by the green bars. For each of these different operations that you answered questions about in the blue questionnaire tab. So soil sampling, ground preparation, soil amendments, seeding the ground cover, and so on and so forth. I noticed just visually that my planting expenses are a little bit higher than the representative farm costs, but I also noticed that my hand weeding or flower removal costs are lower than the representative farm costs. I can look at this exact same information down here, but with values on it. These are the exact same categories that you see up here. And then I have my costs, which are represented by the green bars up above, or the blue bars up above, and the representative farm costs per acre, represented by the green bars up here above. Now it's important here to recognize that in the questionnaire tab, you were answering questions about tracts of land, not necessarily about 1 acre specifically, but here your costs are broken up into costs per acre. Also in the graph above, they're broken up into costs per acre. That's an important distinction to make. And then this column right here will tell you the difference between my costs and the representative farm costs. Right here it says negative values here mean that your costs are lower than the industry averages. So you want to see negative costs. I noticed that in my ground preparation, I am lower than the representative farm costs by 16%, or $31.41. Or I also noticed that I can apply mulch for $148.91 less than the representative farm in New York, which is a 53% difference. You're going to find very similar analyses in the production year report card and the wages and use rates report card. The one difference in the production year report card is that you will see the first graph is broken up into 2 different sections, and that's simply because of scale. Harvesting costs are so much larger than all the other costs that they would dwarf these costs, and you wouldn't be able to distinguish between your costs and the representative farm costs because they would be so small. So we put it on its own little graph over here. Otherwise, everything is the same. And then you have your wages and use rates. This is, again, very similar. You have your graphic section and your numeric section. It allows you to analyze in different ways these numbers. Now, it's very important that you don't just come here and look at this and say, hey, I'm doing great, my mowing costs are $309.60 less per acre than the representative farm, so great, that's awesome. It's important that you couple all of the information on these 3 tabs with the information on the orange tab, which is the assumed production practices. It's not enough just to say, okay, my costs are lower or my costs are higher. Either I'm doing great or I need to do something about it. You need to come in here and make sure that you understand the differences between your costs and the representative farm costs. You may come in and recognize that your mowing costs are so much lower because you mow fewer times than the representative farm. And that's okay, of course, everybody knows that they grow their products somewhat differently. But the purpose of these 4 tabs is for you to get a deeper look at your production practices, what that's costing you, and hopefully pick out some things that you might be able to do differently. Maybe this will inspire some conversations between you and some of your neighbor farmers, or you and the New York State Berry Growers Association on the different production practices that are used, and help you drive down your costs and increase your margins. So let's jump over here to the assumed production practices and take a look. Now, you'll see that this again is broken up into 3 different sections, very similar to the questionnaire tab, because it's laid out exactly the same. These are the categories over here that you see in the questionnaire tab, also in the pre-production year report card. This first section is looking at your pre-production year. The second section is looking at your production years. And then the third section, your wages and use rates. And it just simply tells you what the assumption is. Soil sampling was done once before ground preparation to determine the soil needs, and the specialized labor rate was used. And these figures tell you what the equipment hours were for the representative farm, how many labor hours were used for the representative farm, and the frequency. You can go through and read the rest of these on your own, and hopefully draw some insights from this, and again, hopefully spark some conversations with people in your community that are doing these same things. And that is the hope from these tools. These tools are not here for your accounting purposes. These tools are certainly not here to make agronomic recommendations, but it's a tool to help you dig deeper into your practices, to help you understand what your costs are, and to help you understand maybe some ways that you can drive those costs down. One very important thing to note is that, as you've noticed, all of these are about production practices, and we have totally skipped over all of the different inputs. And that was on purpose. The intent of this practice was to look specifically at your production practices and not at your inputs. And the last tab then is the calculations tab. Don't worry about this tab at all. You'll see it's got a very similar format, but it just feeds the report card tabs and some of the assumed production practices. I hope that this was useful for you. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. My email address I will put up on the screen is kjw236@cornell.edu. I'll be around to answer any questions that you may have about this or any recommendations or thoughts. Or please, if you find any bugs, please let me know and I will fix them.